Princess Grace attack and softness. On the right, in this brighter second attempt, her effort made on a rougher cartridge paper is more self-consciously artistic and less fresh. Victoria's growing skills were also the result of excellent tuition. In July 1846, Edward Lear, whose Excursions in Italy had just been published, came to Osborne and coached the Queen in draftsmanship. She was also receiving a regular lesson from William Leighton Leach. Good old Leach, as the Queen called him, was a marvellously sensitive draftsman and a glowing painter who exploited to the full the breadth of a watercolour palette, from sombre tones in the depths of foliage to a hard brilliance for flowers and sunlight. Leach was introduced to court by Lady Canning, having been recommended by the Duchess of Sutherland, Victoria's great friend and her mistress of the robes. Her cousin, Richard Cavendish, had been instructed by Leach during his travels in Italy. Leach gave the Queen a basic technical knowledge of the potential of watercolour that Westall had failed to do. I showed how light, that is, brilliancy, was produced by yellow ochre, pink madder and cobalt blue, and darkness, deeper than black, by sepia, purple lake and indigo. Also primitive colours. Using these two classes of colours with their compounds, I then did skies, distance, middle ground, foreground, white clouds, and their dowels, no whiter than a lady's satin dress, and then with the same colours a black dress full of colour and shadow, but with no black in it, and then a great many varieties of green colours. After attending to this part of the lesson with great earnestness, the Queen turned to Lady Canning and said, "This is very wonderful." Leach was a native of Glasgow, and after scraping a living in Scotland as a scene painter and snuff-box decorator, he came south to improve his fortunes. He became a favourite instructor in aristocratic circles. He was a good raconteur and an entertaining mimic, and he soon found that he had a great relish for society. One of his pupils, Sir Coots Lindsay, later the owner of the Grosvenor Gallery, thought he was often held away from the more ardent pursuit of his art by the insistence of is considered by the English unsportsmanlike and ungentlemanly. Albert never really recovered from the huge unpopularity the Batu caused him, but Victoria remained aloof, perhaps even deaf to the taunts. She referred constantly and tactlessly to the prince's homesickness, writing how he loved the Scottish landscape because it reminded him of Thuringia, and how he said that many of the people look like Germans. She was thrilled when, after a good day's sport for Albert, the huntsmen told her she had a lucky foot, and with wifely devotion noted over 2 pages of a sketchbook the exact weights of 6 deer, killed with 6 shots out stalking in the Muckle Pass. Okay, so we have a couple of sketches on the left hand side. The one at the top, it had a very pretty effect, wrote the Queen after watching Albert and the tenants of Balmoral. Leastering, that means spearing. Salmon in the Dee. I wished for Lancia's pencil. Lancia absent, the Queen tried one of her few attempts at a group scene. And then down below, Victoria and Albert first stayed in the simplicity of the Shield at Cusack in August 1849, and it remained a favourite experience of the Queen's frequently repeated. Together they pursued the simple life. To escape Balmoral's middle-class comforts, they built austere shields in picturesque spots at Cusack and Glengelder, where they could stay, virtually unattended in a few humble rooms like the crofters who were their tenants. So they were kind of playing poor, I guess. Together they explored the countryside, enjoying the thrills of being incognito. After a picnic lunch on a very precipitous place above Glen Isla, Albert scribbled on a bit of paper that he had lunched at this spot. He then stuck the note in the ground in a seltzer water bottle for the wonder of later travellers. Victoria was inspired to experiment with different media, and in the 50s briefly took up oils. She painted her children performing Atelier and set their interpretation of Das Hornenschlag in a realistic rather than theatrical bucolic setting. She also painted portraits of Annie and Archie MacDonald, which she later hung in her bathroom at Osborne. They were the children of Albert Gilly from the west of Scotland, a remarkably tall and handsome man in the Queen's opinion. Archie became Jaeger to the Prince of Wales. I don't really know what that means. Annie died of tuberculosis in 1866, and here they are. Archie and Annie MacDonald painted here in the model kennels at Balmoral. Lancia tutored the Queen's efforts in oil and introduced her to pastel, a medium he favoured. In 1851 and 1852, the Queen made dozens of bold, garishly coloured portraits of retainers and tenants and neighbours at Balmoral, the Grants and the Flemings and Jane Mackenzie at her tub, and other Highland lads and lassies whose simplicity and goodness of heart touched her so deeply. She dispensed warm socks and red pinafores when she went visiting, but was the first to admit that her attempts at portraiture were not altogether a success. Lancia had shown her how to draw in chalks, she wrote, but I never could manage that well. classicism. Its rediscovery constituted a romantic rejection of Greek and Roman formalism in favour of distinguished barbarism, poetic, primitive, simple and autonomous. Victoria and Albert's eager identification with it, which seems to us now comical and rather absurd in two foreigners, that's in inverted commas, reflects the lively confidence of their age in all things British and homegrown. In their lifetime, its antiquarian side was not fustian, but energetically modern. Prince Albert's interest in the Highlands reflected his progressive, innovatory character as surely as his inspired organisation of the Great Exhibition in 1851, and Victoria returned there after his death to recreate, as a living testimonial to his superior judgment in all things, the life they had led together. At the peak of her seclusion in 1868, when murmurings against her prolonged withdrawal from public life were becoming louder, she published Leaves from the Journal of Her Life in the Highlands, extracts from her diary with illustrations of her life in Scotland with the Prince and the happy excursions they had made together. Her children and some members of her household disliked its publication. The book gave the impression that the Queen's life was all play and no work, and during her long absences from England, either in Scotland or on the Isle of Wight, such an impression seemed inadvisable. So this little sketch here. Victoria often visited the workers on the Balmoral estate. This baby asleep in a wooden cradle is the newborn son of Donald Stewart, one of the keepers. William Gladstone, Prime Minister during much of the period of Victoria's determined retreat, was compassionate and understanding, and travelled to Balmoral frequently to dispatch state business. In 1869, after much pressure, gently but firmly applied, he prevailed upon the Queen to show herself again in her capital and open Blackfriars Bridge and Holborn Viaduct, both high examples of the age of iron. In 1871, the Prince of Wales had been very ill indeed with typhoid, and a national day of thanksgiving for his delivery was proclaimed. Victoria, in spite of her disclaimers that life, especially as a queen, held any pleasure for her, found that she thoroughly enjoyed herself. A day of triumph, she wrote to Vicky. Really most marvellous, such touching affection and loyalty cannot be seen anywhere, I think. Millions must have been out, and the decorations were really beautiful, the cheering deafening. When we were stopping at Temple Bar, amid deafening cheers, I took dear Bertie's hand and pressed it. People cried. On that occasion, John Brown, in his very fullest and very handsome full dress, rode on the box, and it was in some good part his achievement that the Queen felt strong enough to return to public life. Her first volume of Leaves was dedicated to the memory of Albert, her second, More Leaves, published in 1884, to that of John Brown. Her nature demanded support from someone whom she had created in her mind's eye as a source of strength, wisdom and truth, serving her as exclusive priestess. Although house as well as out, gaining considerable increases in revenue. He remained a servant. On his death he was commemorated by an astonishing tribute. The faithful and devoted personal attendant and friend is immortalised in copper plate engraving at the base of a column in the personal pantheon of Victoria, the mausoleum at Frogmore. Now this little sketch on the left hand side is, in spite of her assiduous widowhood, Queen Victoria never lost her sense of fun, as it is shown by this lively picture of her taking tea in a snowstorm up in the Cairngorms. And then here on the right, the Queen welcomed Albert's passion for deer stalking and often followed the hunting party on horseback or on foot, recording in her sketchbook such scenes as these two keepers tensely watching for game. Benjamin Disraeli became Prime Minister for most of 1868 and again from 1874 to 1880, fascinated and flattered the Queen into renewed interest in her ever more splendid realm. Both he and John Brown, at the same period of the Queen's life, knew how to handle her, how to reassure and complete her when she was stalked by Albert's ghost, which made her feel bereft and hesitant and inadequate. John Brown called her a woman, and Disraeli the fairy. John Brown told her it was very pleasant to walk with a person who is always content. Disraeli in conversation would say, "We authors, Mom." Her zest, her wit, her liveliness returned in the decade of the 70s. She was wreathed in smiles, wrote Disraeli after one of their many long audiences. And as she tattled, she glided about the room like a bird. She did not paint Dizzy's seamed, compelling, bony and ironic face, but among her sketches made at this date appears one watercolour of a primrose. So this is it here. Victoria never painted flowers except as flashes of colour in a landscape, but she sent by train to Disraeli in London nosegays of flowers she had picked herself at Osborne. His favourites, he told her, were the primroses, the ambassadors of spring, the gems and jewels of nature. His gallantry knew no bounds. They show, he wrote, that your Majesty's sceptre has touched the enchanted isle. Victoria chose a primrose rather than the man. After Albert died, people recede from the pages of her sketchbooks, the two-folio albums bound in soft suede with blue spine and corners, into which she stuck the best work from her smaller sketch pads after his death, began with a watercolour view of the mausoleum at Frogmore, where the prince lay buried and where she was to join him. She painted it from her windows at Windsor Castle, and it sounds